Hi, my name is Chuck Fall, and I'm with the Green Liberty Caucus. I'm the chief proponent for a Green Liberty sensibility. And my guest today is John Spritzler. He is uh, a writer, a revolutionary, and we're talking about advancing the vision for an egalitarian society and what's the best argument to make for that. Let me just quickly say that Green Liberty is um, in solidarity with the idea of an egalitarian revolution. I've posted at the website a, a notion that John might disagree with, that there are different types of egalitarian. Suggest there's radicals such as John, and I suppose I would include myself in that. But then there's conservative egalitarians, people that recognize that we have a serious problem of wealth inequality, irresponsibility from the elites, and that the approach to making things better would be a traditional, uh, you know, get people elected to office and work through the machinations of state and so on. John, give us an introduction to yourself, your background. You're retired, you have had a career, but you've always, I guess, since 2012, you started your website. Um, Give us some background on your experience and your thinking as an intellectual. I'm going to focus on you. Go for it.
Okay, thank you, Chuck. Well, I happen to be 78 years old. I live in Boston, Massachusetts. A short bio would probably go like this. I went to Dartmouth College as a freshman in 1964. From 1964 to 68, when I graduated, I was up to my neck in anti-Vietnam War activism. I organized one of the first Vietnam teach-ins in 1968 and invited, as well as a number of anti-war personalities to be on the panel. I also invited the Assistant Secretary of State for Southeast Asian Affairs to defend the war. And I did that knowing that he would be defeated soundly and exposed as a liar. Hundreds and hundreds of students came to the teach-in who were pro-war. Most of the students on campus were pro-war. This was 1968, and it was Dartmouth College. And they came because they wanted to see the anti-war people get clobbered by the State Department guy. And what happened is they were shocked to see that the opposite happened. The State Department guy was exposed as a flat-out liar by a number of faculty who knew the material inside out and backwards about Vietnam and the whole issue. And they became anti-war right in front of my eyes, hundreds and hundreds of them. And the next year, the conservatives, after I graduated, I stayed on as a radical outside agitator for Students for Democratic Society. And the next year, in 1969, the conservatives on campus called for a pro-war demonstration. And I dreaded what was going to happen. But on the day of the demonstration, of the pro-war demonstration, there were about 50 pro-war demonstrators on the middle of the campus, in the green area, the grassy area. And in a campus of only 3,000 students, there were 1,500 students who came out against the war with homemade signs against the war, forming like a snake that just went all around and up and down and across the green area. And everybody was surprised, including me. No one expected this. No one realized the profound change that had taken place in the thinking of students on campus and faculty. But as soon as we and Students for Democratic Society saw that we were now the majority, not the tiny minority we thought we were, we started acting like the majority and immediately made plans to take over the administration building around the demand to abolish the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC, that supplied second lieutenants for the war in Vietnam. And we did it. And we took it over. And about 40 people were arrested in jail, and then the student body went on strike in support of us. And the college was shut down. The trustees had to fly in for an emergency meeting, and they decided they had no choice. They abolished ROTC. And the lesson I learned on that day, more important than anything I learned in a classroom, was that in order to have a political sea change, two things have to happen. One, the majority of people need to know that in opposing the establishment, they're morally right. They have to be confident that they're right. And two, that's not enough. Two, the majority of people need to know that they are the majority of people in wanting that change. Put the two together and you have an explosive situation, which I saw in 1969.
Okay,
Well,
John, I'm going to interrupt you. So that truth, that insight that you gained in college at Dartmouth is something that informs your thinking today.
exactly. That's the point. That's the main thing about my biography. So, I can mention I became a high school teacher and then a biostatistician. I worked at Harvard in AIDS clinical trials and retired in 2012. But I've been trying to help people learn they are the majority in wanting to remove the rich from power, to have real, not fake democracy with no rich and no poor. And I think that to the extent that we accomplish that, we will succeed in making what I call an egalitarian revolution.
Okay, let me ask you a quick question. Well, okay, and just for further background, you've been a deep follower of classical Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist theory, and at some point you uh, became a inspired by David, and I'm going to have
Stratman.
Stratman, and you've had some profound truth experiences around your very confident position that people are in a state of readiness to, in effect, liberate.
Yeah,
Now, before we go, and I want you to kind of riff off of this, why is it necessary that we have any liberation thinking at all? What is your fundamental perspective on what's wrong in society? If you
what's wrong in society is that the people with the real power, a ruling billionaire plutocracy, treat everybody else like dirt. And there's just multiple ways. It ranges from the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza to things like telling retail workers, people who work, in stores as salespersons, that they have to be on call, ready to go to work when they get a phone call, which they may or may not get. But if they do get it, they have to show up. So they can't arrange their life to have, a babysitter if they need to go to work, or to have a second job because they're paid so little on the one that they have for the few days that they may or may not get called to work and so forth. They're treated like dirt. And it goes on and on and on. And the way people are treated like dirt is open, routine, not secretive. And then, of course, there are the secret things that the ruling class does, which I know, Chuck, you refer to as state crimes. The assassinations of people like, JFK and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, by the way, and Fred Hampton. The fact that the government assassinates these people is not widely known. And so, that's a state crime, and other things that you could argue are happening. Yeah, I've written articles exposing these things. I think we should expose the state crimes. But as you know, I think it's a big mistake to use exposing state crimes as a substitute for the more effective and hence more important task, which is to do the things that maximally are effective in building the egalitarian revolutionary movement, which today requires doing things to let people know that in wanting to remove the rich from power, to have real, not fake democracy with no rich and no poor, in that egalitarian aspiration, they are the vast majority today. The task that we have is not to persuade people to want to do that. They already would love it. The task is to persuade them that it's possible, because the current situation is that all the hundreds of millions of Americans and billions worldwide who would love to do that, to remove the rich from power that way, they believe it is impossible. And the reason they believe it's impossible is primarily because they think that too few people want to do it.
Okay, so let me interrupt. I'm going to interject right now. Okay, so you have in your Substacks, and we've participated in Zoom calls on the Green Renaissance, bi-monthly meetups, and um, and so you know this to be true, and it frustrates you when people don't grasp this fundamental truth that people are already in a state of a kind of readiness to get rid of the ruling class. So let's just talk about that idea of a
Okay,
readiness to get rid of the
yeah.
ruling class.
When I look at the Zoom call, I see you, I don't see me, but I want to show people something. So how can
Okay, I think if you share, you're going to be fine.
I don't want to share a file. I just want to put something where my face is.
Well,
Or,
let's do, yeah, let's try this. So go ahead and put your
okay, there.
badge right up onto
Now,
the right
um,
there.
okay.
Okay.
Can people see this?
I'm going to read it. It says, it's a green button. Let's remove the rich from power. Have real, not fake democracy with no rich and no poor. That's from your pdrboston.org website. PDR stands for
People for Democratic Revolution.
People for a Democratic Revolution, which is language you used before you adopted the term egalitarian. Is that kind of, give us some
That,
background on this?
yeah,
Talk about, you've
that's
talked,
right. The website was created before I thought of the word egalitarian to use
okay,
instead.
People for a Democratic Revolution, and you've talked to 500 people and you've simply posed this to them. You said you present the proposition: let's remove the rich from power, have real, not fake democracy with no rich, no poor. And by a vast majority, people give a thumbs up. You don't give any necessarily context or why we should do this. You just present the proposition, and people surprise you by saying, "Yeah, why not?"
Yeah, you're right, except I talked to much more than 500 people.
Okay.
Let me just point out that people listening to this Zoom call, let me say to those people, you don't have to believe anything I say on this subject. You can take a 3x5 card and write, let's remove the rich from power, have real, not fake democracy with no rich and no poor. And you can go to your neighborhood shopping, you know, shopping area where stores are, and grocery stores, entrance to grocery stores, drugstores, so forth. And you can do what I did. You can just say to people, excuse me, I'd like to ask you a question. Do you think the message on this 3x5 card is a good idea or a bad idea? You will discover, unless you live in Beverly Hills or someplace like that, and maybe even there, I don't know, but if you live in a typical working class, middle class neighborhood like I do, which is Brighton, Massachusetts, a neighborhood of Boston called Brighton, you will discover 85 to 90% of the people say it's a good idea or a great idea. You will even find this to be true, as I did, if you go to a pro-Trump rally, which I did, where there were hundreds and hundreds of people, all white, waving American flags. The rally was focused on defending the Second Amendment right to bear arms because the Attorney General in Massachusetts was trying to get a law passed to restrict it. They were almost all, had clothing that had the National Rifle Association, NRA logo. And they were listening to speeches made in front of the State House. And I went up to 50 random people. I had a T-shirt with the image you just saw on the sticker that says, let's remove the rich from power and so forth, with that image, in large on my front. And I had buttons to give to people that with the same image. And I went to 50 random people. I tapped them on the shoulder as they were listening to the speech and said, can I ask you a question? And they turned around and said, yeah. And I said, do you think that the message on this button, let's remove the rich from power, have real, not fake democracy with no rich and no poor, is a good idea or a bad idea? 86% of those 50 people, 43, said it was a good idea. Many said it was a great idea. All of them gladly took the button that I offered them, and many pinned it on their shirt right on the spot. It was a hot day, and a woman insisted I take one of the bottles of cold water that she had brought to distribute in appreciation for what I was doing. And 3 people said they didn't know what they thought, and the other 4 were hostile, verbally hostile, said things like, well, this is capitalism, we have a right to get rich, blah, blah, things like that. 86% loved the egalitarian revolutionary message. But
Now, go ahead, and I have a question.
But the people in charge of the rally, the people who lead those pro-Trump events, never, 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 ever talk about what that egalitarian revolutionary message is. They don't want the people at those rallies to know that 86% of them think it's a great idea to remove the rich from power that way. They want people at the rally to think that everyone except maybe them personally agrees with the little 4% who want to keep it so that there you have some rich and some poor. And they have the people at that rally never knew that they were in the vast majority wanting to remove the rich from power, probably felt that they should keep their mouth shut about such a view, or else they'd be ostracized
So John,
from the people. And that's how it works.
why do you think there's such receptivity to this proposition to remove the rich from power so can have real?
Because people know that they are treated like dirt by the rich routinely,
So,
routinely,
so let's,
openly every day.
okay, so let's unpack this. I mean, you're basically arguing that in what I call the state of readiness to take to make what's to by popular, mainstream legacy media standards is a preposterous thing to assert. It's preposterous to say that the rich would be removed from power. It's just on its face, even though you and I have kind of talked about, the New York Times article that actually uses the word egalitarian in a headline, where two pundits say, things are kind of getting a little bit too much extreme wealth um, divide. Maybe we need some more egalitarian principles. So the idea of egalitarian is out there, but in the legacy mainstream media, this idea that the rich would be removed from power, just like the king was removed from power in France in 1789, as the American oligarchs, if you will, removed the king from power. And there has been a history of democratic energy to not be dominated by a ruling class. I mean, this is kind of what you're addressing. You're talking as though there's this latent in the consciousness of people a readiness to say and assert, let's change society. But they don't hear it from others, so they don't believe that
Yeah,
that anybody else accepts this.
yeah.
They're a
Here,
little
here
bit
is
cookie.
here is the amazing fact. As I said, you can verify this for yourself with a 3x5 card. 85 to 90% of random people that you could meet in your neighborhood would love to remove the rich from power, have real, not fake democracy with no rich and no poor, but they think it's impossible. But they would love it if it could happen. And yet, any and every expression of that egalitarian revolutionary aspiration is totally censored in all of the media, the mass media, the alternative media that the rich also control, in virtually every magazine, radio station, you name it. There is zero expression of what the vast majority of people would love to see happen. Zero. And the effect of that, of course, is that it creates in everybody's mind the wrong impression that nobody else has that aspiration, and they better keep their mouth shut about having that aspiration, because if they said it out loud, they'd probably risk ostracism. They'd risk people being hostile to them. They'd risk maybe even being thought dangerous. So the best thing to do is keep silent about it. And so for the most part, that's what people do. And that in turn reinforces the belief that nobody has this aspiration. This is how the rich stay in power. This is the fundamental
Okay.
number
So
one way they stay in power.
okay, so we can unpack this, how they stay in power. You write extensively on the divide and conquer technique, and we could talk about the problem of Israel and the Zionist project in Gaza, which has been characterized as genocide. But let me just quickly ask you, you did one of your experiments, and I say these are experiments, where you speak to people and you present the proposition, let's remove the rich from power. I have an essay at the Green Liberty site. I switched that into a ditch the rich campaign proposition. Isn't it? And then when you introduce this on one of your moments, because you've done this several times in different times over the last 10 years, I think. One of the issues that was popular in your neighborhood was the problem of gentrification, the loss of affordable housing. People are getting squeezed, and you, in the context of let's have affordable housing in here in Boston, you represented the proposition to remove the rich from power, so we could have affordable housing, so we could have better systems in place so that people aren't treated like dirt. Isn't the prospect of removing the rich from power in order to have, quote, affordable housing a really low bar for doing something so momentous and epical, to remove the rich from power? I mean, isn't there a better reason, or are the reasons for doing this irrelevant, in your opinion? You
I'm,
catch
I'm,
where I'm going with this? Because it's one thing to say, accept the proposition. It's another thing to build a movement and organize around that. But then all along the way, people don't we naturally want to rationalize why we do what we do?
I guess I don't understand your question.
Oh, my question is, removing the rich from power is a huge event, right?
Are you saying that we should only do it for a good reason, not for a weak reason?
Well, I'm saying, well, I guess this is what we're unpacking right now. If one, do we need a reason to entertain the prospect of removing the rich from power? I mean, maybe that's the first thing where I think we do need reasons. I think as thinking people, it's natural to have a reason to do something as preposterous as removing the rich from power. Now, when the American colonials removed the king from power, one of the chief reasons was that the king was putting troops inside colonials' homes. They were impressing men off the street to go to put them into warships. So these were, and the list in our Declaration of Independence is quite lengthy on the reasons to do this. But when you pose the proposition to remove the rich from power, there is no reason. You avoid that. I don't know if you avoid it. It's not present in the proposition. And I'm simply asking you that when someone says, yes, let's remove the rich from power, I accept that proposition. There's naturally, am I wrong to say that it's natural to have a reason for doing that? Is that not a necessary? Does the reason get in the way of the proposition?
Chuck, excuse me. People have all sorts of reasons why they would love to remove the rich from power. When they talk about a particular reason, they tend to focus on a reason which they are fairly confident is shared by many other people. For example, in my neighborhood and many, many, many others in the United States, as you mentioned a minute ago, people are extremely angry at the fact that there's a lack of affordable housing, and at the same time, luxury housing is being built, sprouting up like mushrooms, totally unaffordable to working class people. So there's a widespread anger, and pretty much everybody knows that everybody else is also angry at that. So I created a sign for people to hold up and be photographed holding up. The sign says, "We the people want affordable housing for all. To get it, we aim to remove the rich from power, to have real, not fake democracy with no rich and no poor." And I stood in front of the main grocery stores and the main drugstore in my zip code of Brighton, Massachusetts. And I showed the sign to people as they were entering, and I said, "I'm taking photographs of people displaying the sign to be seen publicly so that the public can see that they're not alone in feeling this way. Would you like me to take your photo holding it?" So that's all I had to say. You know, I got 500 people who said, yes, I would. And they did. And if you go to my website, pdrboston.org, at the very top, you'll see where to click to see all 500 of those photos. Now, why did I talk about affordable housing instead of the genocide in Gaza? Or, well, I did it before the genocide was happening, but you get the point. Why didn't I talk about the assassination of JFK or 9/11 being an inside job? The very top of the website in red, Chuck. There you go. In the red lines there. That's where you can click to get this. So this is the second red line. Yeah, right there. That's right. So there we go. There they are.
Yeah.
Now, it was affordable housing that gave these people the confidence that they were saying something about an issue that lots of other people also cared very much about. That's what made affordable housing different from, say, state crime issues. Now, there is nothing less noble or less principled about people's wanting affordable housing for all than people wanting a real investigation into the assassination of JFK. There's nothing less noble or less principled about the one than the other. And I think that it's a big mistake to wrongly think that the people holding these signs are any less concerned about unjust oppression of people around the world than you are or than I am. They're not. I have conversations with people, and they're just as concerned about such things. Now, they might not have the same factual knowledge about them, although in some cases they have more factual knowledge than I do about some of them, I've discovered. But the facts about state crimes are not readily accessible to people. People do not experience with firsthand experience that 9/11 was an inside job. They do not experience with firsthand experience that the CIA killed JFK. In contrast, they experience with firsthand experience that there's a lack of affordable housing, and luxury housing is being built like mushrooms. So that's the difference.
Well, okay, so okay, and I get that. I get that you um have come to an insight that you communicate in your Substacks. And the insight is that people are ready for ditching the rich. That if this is presented, they will say yes.
Yeah, well, ready is an ambiguous word. They would love to remove the rich from power. That's true. That's a present day actual fact. And it's a fact that most left activists, not only do they not know it, they dispute it. They disbelieve it. They say over and over again, I've heard it said to me on Zoom calls, etc. Most people, they say, don't want to remove the rich from power because they expect and hope to be rich one day themselves and want to be able to have all the power that the rich have when that day comes. And nothing could be further from the truth. They are people who say this are brainwashed by the mass media, by its censorship of the actual egalitarian aspiration. They are brainwashed, and the irony is that they're telling me that ordinary people are the ones who are brainwashed. I mean, the irony is so thick you can cut it with a knife. These activists are totally wrong, and their activism is based on a totally wrong principle, which I think could be characterized this way. Their wrong-headed activism is based on the idea that, well, most people are brainwashed. They support the unjust status quo. They don't want to remove the rich from power. So we have to somehow persuade them to hit them over the head with a 2x4 to make them see that the rich are trying to kill millions and millions of people with the RNA vaccine, and the rich are creating, deliberately creating the massive fires in Maui and Northern California and Los Angeles, and the rich are spraying poison with chemtrails, and they're trying to kill us all with 5G. We have to hit them over the head with these facts that they don't know about, and then they will be so shocked at how horrible the ruling class is that they'll change their mind and realize that we have to remove the rich from power. But until then, they're brainwashed into supporting the rich, and because of that, there's no point in trying to refute the ruling class lies that pit have-nots against other have-nots, that destroy their solidarity, because what's the point in trying to increase the solidarity of a working class that just supports the criminal status quo? So that's why these activists never do what I do in my writing, which is to identify the key lies that the ruling class uses to pit have-nots against have-nots. Number one of which is the lie that racial discrimination against non-whites benefits white working class people, so-called white privilege. Second lie is that the Israeli government's violence against Palestinians is for the purpose of making Jews safe, when in fact it's to enable the billionaires in Israel to oppress the Israeli Jewish working class. Number three lie, that the reason we have this huge wave of illegal immigrants into the United States is because people in South America, Central America, and Haiti, they want to live in a good country where they can have a good life, and so they just want to come here and enjoy the good life, and instead of doing what it takes to make their own nations good. flat out lie. The truth that's never told is that the American ruling class for decades, using both parties, has been doing things south of the border and in Haiti deliberately to force poor people there to have to enter the United States illegally just in order to survive. And if that truth were known, the people who were for deportations, as well as the people against deportations, would be united in wanting to stop the ruling class from doing such a terrible thing. They would all agree. They all agree it was terrible, but people don't know it's happened. They think that just a lot of people want to come here and enjoy the good life that we've made here instead of making a good life for themselves back home. So I focus on exposing these lies, but the left activists who think that people are brainwashed into supporting the status quo, they dismiss these lies as just diversions, not worth even talking about. That the main thing we have to do is to hit people over the head with the truth about 9/11 being an inside job and stuff like that, so that they'll change their mind and maybe then decide that we need to remove the rich from power. It's just totally wrong-headed.
So let
Totally,
me
totally
interject.
wrong-headed.
Let me interject. So basically, you're not arguing that, saying that 9/11 is an inside job, state crime. You don't object. You don't have any problem.
I've written about that myself.
Furthermore, you've written about it already. Where you object to people who are in the truth movement is when they say, let's have the truth about 9/11. Let's have accountability and justice. And then they kind of stop there.
Yeah, they use doing a nice thing. I'll call it a nice thing. Exposing the truth about 9/11 being an inside job and JFK being killed by the CIA and so forth. That's good. I do it myself. I've written articles about that myself. But to make that a substitute for the far more important thing of refuting the lies that pit the have-nots against each other is a terrible mistake. And by the way, as I have said, people think that it's impossible to remove the rich from power. They're hopeless. Well, why do they think that? Well, if all they know and believe is that half of the have-nots are just terrible people, and basically that's what we have in the United States now. The have-nots are divided into two groups around these key issues: immigration, deportations, Israel, and critical race theory being taught in the schools. And the ruling class has very, very skillfully created a framework of public discourse based on censorship that results in half the have-nots thinking that the other half are horrible, terrible, immoral, or stupid, dangerously stupid people. You've got the liberals versus the conservatives, the people who listen to NPR versus the people who follow Fox. And they are convinced, each of them, that the other half, and it is basically half, it's almost right down the middle, 50% on these issues, which because of the frameworks have been carefully designed to make that so. Well, if you think that half the have-nots are horrible people, the idea of having solidarity with them, which is required to have a large enough movement to remove the rich from power, is an absurd idea. Of course, you're going to feel hopeless.
Okay, so let me
So,
interject again. So just to be, because we're coming up on, we're approaching an hour. We're going to go over an hour, if you don't mind, John, because I want to touch on some things I want to share.
yeah, well, but King Charles is going to be visiting me in half an hour, so I might have to leave. But okay.
So I understand, you're basically making, I don't know if it's a classical class criticism, But where you what you hammer on is that the ruling class, they use a divide and conquer strategy. They pit have-nots against have-nots. You have a strong criticism of the how to think about Israel and Zionism. And if we wanted, we could touch on that. Um, People can get all of this from your Substack and your website, and I will share those in a moment. I want to go um, to your uh, P People for Democratic uh, PDR. What's the and
PDRBoston.org, People for Democratic Revolution.
People for Democratic Revolution. And I'll just tell you, for anybody watching, I consider myself an anarchist who believes in good government, and I say good government to purposefully be paradoxical, because I'm not so idealistic to think that there won't be structures in society.
Well, I say good government too.
Yeah, so, and I think if you ask the majority of people, they're going to want that also. And I think what you're clearly trying to do is identify that common wellspring of, as you call it, aspiration, to be free and to not be encumbered by poverty, by limitations on getting access to good education, encumbered by not accessing medicine so that we can live well and not be sick. And as an environmentalist and someone in the green movement, to be free from toxins which have been put into society without appropriate limitations. At your website, you've so let's just touch briefly on your criticism of some classical left theory that actually, in your opinion, there's a negative perspective on the working classes, even though we celebrate.
Here is why I am an anti-Marxist. So, and whoops, what happened? You're just showing
Can you see your
pictures.
screen?
Yeah, I see
I want to go back to your home page. Oh, this is a different.
No, that's the photos. You got to go to pdrboston.org. There you are. Yeah.
And so here we are.
Yeah. Go. Okay.
No
So,
capital, no to capitalism, no to
yeah,
socialism.
yeah. If you click on the communism thing, you'll read the basis for what I'm saying. It's based on Karl Marx's own words.
Okay.
So let me just start by saying that Karl Marx was an intellectual in the 1800s. Back then, and still today, intellectuals had an elitist view of ordinary working class people. Marx was not unusual. He was typical in having the same elitist view of working class people that other intellectuals did, conservatives, liberals, academics, whatever. In his famous Das Kapital, he quotes approvingly Adam Smith saying that factory workers are rendered as stupid as a human being could possibly be. Marx talked about the idiocy of rural life when referring to peasants. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx discusses how the working class, the proletariat, gets enlightenment from members of the bourgeoisie who suffer economic hard times and fall into the proletariat, that's where enlightenment comes from. It is Marxism is a theory. of social change. It's wrong, but this is what the theory says. It says that as a result of impersonal economic laws, capitalism will create eventually a crisis of capitalism that will cause the proletariat to replace it with socialism, which will then lead, after a certain period of time, to communism and a classless society. And Marxism is about why this will all happen, not because ordinary working class people want it to happen, but despite the fact that they do not. In other words, it will happen for a reason analogous to the Adam Smith's invisible hand, where Adam Smith argued that even though everybody acts in their own self-interest, the candlestick maker makes candlesticks just to make a profit, the baker bakes bread just to make his profit, and so forth. That Adam Smith said the result of this, unintended by people, not a subjective aim, nonetheless, the result is that it's a good world where people have candlesticks and can see and bread to eat and so forth. Well, Marx made a twist on that. According to Marxist theory, there are indeed unintended consequences that stem from the fact that people act in their self-interest, that the people who own the means of production act in their self-interest, which includes having lower wages, for example, and the people who do not own the means of production, the proletariat, act in its self-interest, which includes the opposite, namely higher wages, better working conditions, and so on. And that the whole work of his Das Kapital is to show that the result of people acting in their self-interest, which is what they do, is what I just said, that, crisis of capitalism that leads to the proletariat taking over, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this view attracts people who want a classless society. It attracts people who want a classless society and who also have a very elitist view of working class people. It's a wonderful viewpoint because it says you can keep your elitist view of working class people. That's okay, because it's going to happen despite the fact that ordinary working class people do not aim for it or want it, that they only think with their belly, that they only have trade union consciousness, meaning I want more, more, more for me. That's how Vladimir Lenin characterized it. And so what you have is Marxists who have this profoundly elitist contempt for ordinary working class people. The proletariat in Marxism is an abstract force, a Hegelian kind of abstract force, a historical force. And its importance for Marxists, and they say it themselves, you can read their own words, the importance of the working class has nothing to do with working class people having positive anti-capitalist egalitarian values and aims. No, the importance of the working class under Marxism is that they are numerically the largest class, or will be in case of early Russia, and that they are at the bottom of society, the most oppressed, which means that ending their oppression will result in ending all oppression. So the importance of the working class for Marxists has to do with the fact that there are a lot of them and that they are oppressed. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that they have positive values that ought to shape all of society. And because the Marxists don't believe that they do have those positive values, that they have just the same selfish values as everybody, for that reason, the Marxists, when they come into power, when there's a Marxist regime in power, absolutely does not want ordinary working class people to have the real say in society. Oh no, that would be terrible. It has to be the communists, the Marxists, with the real say in society because they're the only ones who really subjectively want a classless society. And that's why Marxist regimes are so anti-democratic. So
And
as a result, well, as a result of this wrong view of ordinary working class people, there is not a single Marxist writing about the fact that the purpose of Israeli violence against Palestinians for more than 7 decades now has been to make of the Palestinians a frightening, existentially threatening boogeyman enemy, to frighten the Jewish working class in Israel so that they will obey, at least not seriously try to overthrow, the billionaire Jewish rulers of Israel who purport to be protecting them from their, quote, real enemy, the Palestinians. And this is, for example, why in 2011, when 450,000 mostly Jewish working class people in Israel had weeks and weeks and weeks of massive demonstrations against economic oppression of them by the Israeli ruling class, and have the support, according to 2 independent newspaper polls, of 85% in one case or 90% in the other case of the entire Israeli population. And they had numerous demands to transfer wealth from the rich to the working class, including Holocaust survivors who were terribly economically oppressed in Israel. They won zero. And the reason they won zero is that Netanyahu was able to kill the movement by pointing to a clash between Palestinians and Israeli soldiers and demanding that they be patriots and support the government that was protecting them from their real enemy and stop demonstrating against the people who were protecting them from their real enemy. And it killed the movement, just like 9/11 killed many movements in the United States. I know from firsthand experience, making people think, well, it's not appropriate time to protest against the government because the real enemy, is the Muslim terrorists and so forth. And it's extremely effective. It's like in Israel, there's a 9/11 every single day. That's how it works. And why? And if Americans understood this, if they understood that the violence of Israel against Palestinians is for the purpose of economically severely oppressing the Israeli Jewish working class, then we would have like 90% of Americans opposed to U.S. support for Israel. So how come no one's telling this truth? I told it to my neighbor and completely changed her mind. She was passionately pro-Israel Jewish woman. She changed her mind completely when she learned this truth. How come the Marxists are not telling the truth? Well, it's because they say things like Jeff Halper, a Marxist who I was on a webinar with, and you can read about him in my Substack, who said things like, well, John, there is no Israeli Jewish working class. Stupid, idiotic stuff like that. This is what the Marxists are like. They have such contempt for the working class that they can't say the most obvious thing to create working class unity when it's staring them in the face.
Okay. And we, so your I accept your assertion that, in any theory of freedom, and the theory of freedom that, I subscribe to is that, one, there is a ruling class. And I accept the analysis of David Hughes, who, goes into, I guess you would say, conspiracy theory, but basically argues that there is a global plutocratic power structure now that's evolved over time and has collected more and more wealth, and the discrepancy between rich and poor is growing. So I'm satisfied that we are in a state of kind of social and ecological emergency in society, and that we need a movement to liberate from the predicament that we the people aren't in control of any destiny, that we're effectively being fated into what the ruling elites, through their control of economics, are in effect putting out into society. And I'm going to just riff on Ralph Nader, just because he's iconic in the Green Movement. He's, ran for office, but and I think this is speaking to the positive view of people. And and at bottom here, you're saying that some of our leaders and our intellectual leaders and what should be the left, if you will. And I think obviously now the left and right has become blurred on many levels. And in the truth movement, there's people aren't necessarily using left and right language anymore. But Ralph Nader says, if you got a problem, put 10, 20, 100 people, smart people in a room together, let them talk together and think about the problem, let them go through a natural, I guess you would say, authentic, open, transparent thinking process, and they'll come up with a great solution. The people will.
It's like the film 12 Angry Men.
Is is that the theme of that movie, The 12 Angry Men?
Yeah.
And so that's an affirmative, positive, pro-egalitarian sentiment that is expressed by Ralph Nader. He's not necessarily putting on an air of, the purpose of the working class is to, to be a function of another elite class assuming power to somehow make society better. But because that's the point that you're emphasizing, is that we in our movement need to, in our own thinking, look into the mass of people, look into we ordinary people, working class, retired students, whomever we are, but find a common value for our humanity, our empathy for nature and the well-being of all. That is a fundamental.
Yeah,
Well,
but yes, in general, but the problem is generality is not sufficient. Specificity is required. Let me give another example. For hundreds and hundreds of years, before the United States was the United States even, the main way that the ruling elite kept its power over the have-nots was by pitting the have-nots against each other along race lines. That's what chattel slavery was created to do, actually, explicitly, as I talk about in my article about critical race theory on my website. And today in the United States, there is a big social conflict about race, which takes the form of, on the one hand, white working class parents being furious that their children in elementary and high school are being taught that they are evil oppressors because they are white. They don't like that, and they're perfectly justified in not liking that. On the other hand, a lot of Black and Hispanic people, parents, are furious at these white parents because they want the truth about the history of racial discrimination in the United States history to be taught. And they mistakenly, because the ruling class makes sure, they mistakenly view the white parents' anger as coming from racism, from being in support of racial discrimination and so forth. Now, this is a big conflict. It's going on today. Trump is whipping it up still. Now, what makes this conflict such a big conflict is that the truth is censored. The truth is that the purpose of racial discrimination against non-whites has always been to enable the ruling class to oppress not only the non-whites, but the white working class as well. The purpose has been to create resentment and mutual fear between white and non-white have-nots, and in order to oppress both. Now, who tells the truth? Well, Frederick Douglass, again, my article about CRT, read the details. Frederick Douglass explained this with respect to chattel slavery, that it was used to harm not only the blacks, but the poor whites as well. He was very clear about it. Martin Luther King also, in his famous 1965 Selma, Alabama speech, explicitly explained carefully that the racist Jim Crow laws were designed not only to oppress the blacks, as was obvious, but also to oppress the poor whites. Well, the ruling class killed Martin Luther King not that long afterwards. Now, who is telling the truth about the actual anti-working class purpose of racial discrimination today? Well, briefly, Angela Davis did in the 70s, and then she stopped. And you could sort of say Bob Dylan did in the 70s with one song, only a pawn in their game, but it was a very, very bad attempt to do it, frankly, but you could maybe argue he was trying to, but then he stopped. And since then, nobody, absolutely nobody with any substantial audience, and I include Cornel West. Do you think that Cornel West is unaware of what Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King said about the purpose of racial discrimination? The former Harvard professor, Cornel West? Come on. He knows damn well, but he is silent.
Why are they silent on the divide and conquer tactic?
Fear.
Fear of what?
Fear. Well, I'll give you well, fear that you might get assassinated for one thing. But short of that, there's a woman named, I think Williamson is her name. I might be wrong. I think it's Williamson. She's a big book writer. So she has a book that was on the Oprah Winfrey, book list,
Not
It's
Mary Ann Williamson, the spiritual.
no. A black woman, and I think the name is Williams. I don't have it in front of me. It's in my article on CRT.
Okay.
So her book is called Caste, Caste, like in India, right? And it's all about sort of comparing the American racial discrimination with the caste system in India. And, it's about how bad it is and how wrong it is and so forth. And she even has a section of her book about Martin Luther King's Selma, Alabama speech that I was just talking about, which, by the way, you can listen to it and read it on my website. But does she tell her readers what Martin Luther King said in that speech? No, not at all. She merely talks about an anecdote of someone who was in the audience and something interesting that happened, blah, blah, blah. No mention of what Martin Luther King actually said about how Jim Crow laws harmed the poor whites as well as the blacks. No mention of that fact anywhere in her book. And that is why her book is on the Oprah Winfrey list. If she told the truth, she would not have gotten her book on the Oprah Winfrey list, as she damn well knows. And we would not be talking about her because she would be a nobody, not a highly
So
published
let me interject. The truth
author.
is the truth that they are not that this author did not convey, that Cornell West does not convey, is the truth that Martin Luther King conveyed about the divide and conquer of ruling class against the races so that they can control the masses. I mean, that's the fundamental. Fred Hampton was 21-year-old organizing into the working class whites and trying to unite whites and blacks. And there's a theory that that's what made him problematic. Is
Well, more than a theory. I mean, it's almost a certainty. He was like Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton. They were building a movement that had tremendous support from not only blacks, but the white working class. And the whole purpose of Nixon working to start affirmative action was to destroy that solidarity by getting the civil rights movement to adopt the opposite goal that it had under King. In other words, instead of the goal of ending racial discrimination, affirmative action substituted the goal of having reverse racial discrimination so that firefighters had to get a higher score on an exam if they were white than if they were black to be hired and things like that. A fact which the white working class was very well aware of because they were being subjected to this reverse racial discrimination, but which middle class people were made unaware of. It was the conservative media that talked about the reverse racial discrimination. It was the liberal media that censored that fact. If you have a friend who only listens to NPR and the liberal newspaper and ask them about affirmative action, they will tell you, well, it was good because it just meant going to places where black people are to recruit for hires and doing and ending the old racial discrimination. They will be totally unaware of the fact that you had to have a higher score if you were white than if you were black to get the job. They will be totally unaware of it. And so what they think is when they hear of whites opposed to affirmative action, they don't think, well, these people support Martin Luther King and having a dream where his children will be treated not according to the color of their skin, but the content of their character. No, they think that these people are against affirmative action because they're racists. And that's how the divide and rule works. And yet it's people like Cornell West and Jill Stein and so on and so forth who are just ignoring this, not refuting the lie that makes the divide and rule work.
so to just interject again, your argument as an egalitarian is that to have that one, you recognize that this what I call plutocracy is a problem, and you and I could probably list out many, many reasons they're a problem. Our confidence is, and our hope is in a movement of ordinary people who understand that plutocracy is a problem and that the way forward for society is a radically different structure than what we have under our what we call capitalist free market system.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I do in my writing on my website is to give people confidence that there is a good and desirable alternative to our current system of class inequality, some rich and some poor. Now, of course, a lot of people have been taught that, well, no, there is not a good alternative, that the only alternative is even worse. It's a it's like the under living under Stalin with a centralized economy and a dictator. And so since the only alternative is worse, I guess, so the theory goes, we have to sort of just put up with the horrible situation that we have today. So I write a lot about what the good alternative, the good desirable alternative is. And it's what I call egalitarianism. And in order for people to be hopeful, they have to think that there's a way to make things better. And the ruling class works hard to make sure they're hopeless about that. Not only does it work to make them think that it's impossible to remove the rich from power because half the have-nots are against them, but even if they did succeed, it would be worse. So, for example, George Orwell, he wrote two important books, 1984, no, three important books. 1984 is not the one I wanted to focus on, though. The two that I wanted to focus on are Animal Farm and Homage to Catalonia. So, Homage to Catalonia is a not fiction. It's his nonfiction account of his years fighting with the anarchists, who were essentially the egalitarians in Spain in 1936, in the short-lived, 3-year long-lived Spanish Revolution, where they did in fact create essentially an egalitarian society in Spain until they were overthrown by the fascist Franco. So he fought in that. He got wounded and so forth. And his book, Homage to Catalonia, is in praise of the anarchists and what they accomplished and how what it meant, what kind of a society that they created. Okay. Nobody's ever heard of that book. If you're an American who's gone through the American school system, you've never heard of that book. Never.
I'll just for
On
I just want to say my friend Stephen, rest his soul, he's deceased. I grew up with him in San Francisco. Very brilliant. He shared that book with me, and I read it in high school. No, high school, maybe college, but it was an inspiration for me.
Yeah,
For sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
but most Americans have never heard of it.
Oh, it's
On the
obscure.
other hand, Animal Farm,
Ah,
millions and millions of Americans have been told about and often asked to read George Orwell's Animal Farm. And of course, as you know, it's a fictional account that is actually a scathing
criticism.
criticism of the Soviet Union for being totally unequal in the name of supposedly being for equality, right?
Right.
Okay. And the famous line in it is that everybody was equal, but some were more equal than others. Well, what are children taught that this book is about? They're not taught that it is written as a scathing criticism of a particular uh, government in the Soviet Union. They're taught that it's a book about how it's not really possible to have equality.
Mm.
That's what they're taught. And if you want to have equality, Well, you're very naive and foolish because don't you know it'll just mean that that all the animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Okay, so this is how people are made to feel hopeless. It's a very important part of the ruling class's strategy of social control. And so I write a lot about the fact of egalitarianism in Spain, the fact of egalitarianism in human history, even thousands of years ago, and so forth, and the possibility of it, and what it would look like, or how it could look like, and how we could, deal with problems like the abuse of power, and how it would not be a centralized government in order to have the kind of economy that is based on from each according to reasonable ability, to each according to need or reasonable desire, with scarce things equitably rationed according to need, that does not require a centralized government at all, and so on and so forth, that yeah, the entrepreneurial spirit would be alive and well, even more so than today, and so on. I address these issues because it's about making people hopeful that we can have a better world.
And maybe, John, then that's why, and we're going to wrap up. We've gone an hour, almost and a half, um, and we should keep talking and make these artifacts. I accept your ideas. I accept um, the importance of people being hopeful. I don't think what we have today in society is inevitable. I think it was everything that we have in society is the consequence of decisions that were made. Um, I mean, part of my criticism is that if JFK and the other assassinations in the 60s did not occur, or if the people rose up and protested JFK and demanded true accountability and not the fake accountability we got from Warren Commission, that there would have been a popular movement of resistance to this wicked, evil class power structure that was bent on building empire. And so we need hope. Uh, I I I don't like to hear um, people say that there is no hope and that we're kind of doomed. I can't personally accept that, and I don't want to live with that. That's kind of just where I'm at as a political truther, as a green libertarian. I'm interested in advancing a national discussion about we the people assuming some destiny instead of suffering what I feel is fate because of the divide and conquer tactic to keep us from talking together and having a negative perspective on common working class people. And it's not just common working class people, it's even common professional class people, that we're all basically greedy and that we're just kind of doomed, and what we have is the result of our inherent greed. So I am struck, and we're going to close this conversation, but I am struck by, there are people that say, well, maybe humankind should just be wiped off the earth because there's such a quote virus and pestilence on the planet, which is a pretty dark perspective. And I don't accept that. I don't think you do either. Um, so so I think an egalitarian message is an important one, and there's history to support the argument that people can talk together. They can make society better. We just have to cut through the fog of war, cut through the divide and conquer tactic. And I'll let you make the final word here on, you know, how should we be thinking about Israel? How should we be thinking about resisting this genocide? How do we somehow get an egalitarian notion into the minds of the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Americans and the Europeans, that the problem is not the Palestinian wanting to kill all the Israelis, but that deep down, the Israeli people are essentially being played by what you say is a quote Zionist billionaire class. So give us a final thought on breaking through that.
Well, we need to tell people what you just said, and and be creative in doing it, because I know from personal experience that when I discuss the actual purpose and the goals of the Zionist leaders, the people, the rich Zionist leaders that control Israel, and how anti-Jewish working class they are and have been going back to the days of the Holocaust, when they sabotaged rescue efforts of Jews from the Nazis, when those efforts did not entail sending the Jews to Palestine. They sabotaged those efforts because they wanted Jews in Palestine to become their working class. They wanted a working class of their own. Well, when I discussed this and how they severely economically oppress the Jewish working class in Israel and use the Palestinian boogeyman enemy, which they create with their violence against Palestinians, as a way of killing the movement of working class Jews in Israel. When I tell these initially passionately pro-Israel Jewish people the truth, they do a 180. They do a 180 and they end up agreeing with me. So what I'm thinking is, if I can persuade a handful of people this way, think about what a dedicated large movement spreading this truth would do with the American population. And think about how frustrating it is that people come up with excuses for not sharing this truth. And, as I've experienced, well, it's a crime. It's a crime to make excuses for not sharing this truth. And
And the,
yet,
and the truth is that we are subject to a divide and conquer program. I mean, that's the really
yeah, but then to be persuasive in saying that, we have to be specific. The lies about uh, about racial discrimination benefiting ordinary white people, the white privilege rhetoric, which,
right,
for the last 10 years, that's all you hear is white privilege, white privilege, white privilege. The way Donald Trump got elected was largely by simply refusing to accuse ordinary white people of benefiting from racial discrimination. That's all he had to do. Is that, unlike Hillary Clinton, who was Mrs. White Privilege, Donald Trump was, no, I don't say that.
right.
And of course he was accused of being a racist for not saying it, but that's how he got a lot of votes. And so we have to be specific about this, the specific lies that are being told. It can't just say they're trying to divide us, and that's wrong. I mean, that's a true statement, but it's not sufficient. What's required is to look at the actual false beliefs that are being spread by the ruling class, identify them, and identify the evidence that shows that they are false, and sharing that evidence with people in a respectful manner, not accusing people who disagree with you or who believe the wrong idea, being horrible people, and, wagging your finger at them and accusing them of being, you know, bad people. No, we have to have an effort to engage people respectfully and share the truth. In other words, let me give you an example. I was at a rally against in favor of the right to bear arms. It was about 10 years ago, And there were a lot of people, mostly white, but not all, and listening to speeches about the right to bear arms and everything. And the issue of illegal immigration came up. And so I said to the man next to me, a white man about my age, I said, "Did you know that that the that the U.S. government, both political parties for years, has been doing things deliberately to force poor people to have to enter the U.S. illegally in order just to survive?" And he said, "No, I didn't know that. That's very interesting." Now, this is a man who would ordinarily be supporting the deportations, right? But this is a man who is on our side, who is against the ruling class doing bad things to people. And we need to build a movement that enlists all these good people. But instead, what we have is the ruling class is orchestrating a sort of two silos. One silo is the have-nots who think the other have-nots are evil, horrible people, and they have big demonstrations and so forth. And then the other half, well, they have their silo, and they hear Fox News tell them how the liberals hate them and accuse them of being evil, racist, and so forth. And that's not gonna do what we need. What we need is to bring down the silo walls with the censored truths. That's what we need.
Well, let's end our recording on that note. And I would like to keep talking with you, and this will be posted at a Rumble site. And this is an hour and a half, might be too long for some people to track, but these are not simple ideas. But what we're doing in our conversation is bearing witness, to what we understand is happening, and that there does need to be a movement, and that's what we're talking about, an egalitarian possibility. And
Good.
you're John Spritzler, and you have a Substack at John Spritzler, and you have another website that's People for Democratic PDRBoston.org.
Yeah, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Hey, great conversation. Stick around. I'm going to end the recording, and we can just debrief for a moment, okay? All right, thank you
Okay.
for watching, everyone.